Britain is broken. There is no doubt about that. These problems are not sudden nor new, but have been compounding for decades. As with anything that's been broken at home, whether a phone or a vase or whatever it is, the first question that comes to mind is, who broke it? And with Britain, I believe the answer lies with 5 people, all from the post-war era. Rupert Murdoch, the first man on the list, is not even British. The multi-billionaire media behemoth. Murdoch began his media empire in Australia, his own home country, where he owned more than half of the newspapers and 2/3 of the total media. He successfully went after the Prime Minister in 1972, successfully ousting him. He ended up buying out The Sun, Sky News, Fox News, The Wall Street Journal, The Times, Talk TV, The Sunday Times, The New York Post, and so much more. He backed Margaret Thatcher in 1979 in her bid to become Prime Minister, which would end up being a mutually beneficial relationship for the both of them. He would give them favourable media coverage and she would give them preferential treatment, such as his acquisition of the Times Group newspaper, which included the Sunday Times and the Times. Now, normally this would have been referred to the Competition Regulation Authority here in the UK, but after a private meeting with Murdoch, Thatcher let it slide. He would also go on to fight the printing unions fiercely, again, all under the watch and okay of Margaret Thatcher. According to Cabinet Minister Norman Fowler, any complaints or resistance from any colleagues would be returned with, "Why are you so opposed to Rupert? He's going to get us in." He then turned to support Tony Blair and supported him over his invasion in the Iraq War, and stuck with it long after it became obvious that it was a disaster. He then turned to support to David Cameron, the upcoming Tory leader, before backing Brexit with all his media might. The influence this man has had not just on Britain but the Anglophonic world is immense. To put it into context, he's not just able to have meetings with world leaders whenever he wants, he makes them come to him. Tony Blair reportedly had a 25-hour flight from Britain all the way to Australia just to have a meeting with him. According to Tony Blair, "I wouldn't have been going all the way around the world if it hadn't been a very deliberate and, again, very strategic decision that I was going to go and try to persuade them," Blair said in 2012. The minimum objective was to stop them tearing us to pieces, and the maximum objective was, if possible, to open the way to support. One of his newspapers, The Sun, has a 100% success rate in picking winning prime ministers over the last 45 years. That's how powerful he is. Ed Miliband tried cozying up to him in the lead up to the election, but ended up bad-mouthing him in front of the House of Commons. Subsequently, he went from having a slim margin with the Conservatives to losing pretty badly, in part thanks to the infamous bacon sandwich incident, where Ed Miliband was looking quite goofy eating a bacon sandwich. This image, along with a warning, was plastered on the front page of The Sun for everyone to see the day before the election, all thanks to him attacking Rupert Murdoch in the House of Commons. Boris Johnson flew out to meet Murdoch in the United States and in his time as Prime Minister. He also had meetings with him prior to running as Prime Minister and prior to running general elections. When Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, when Suella Braverman was Home Secretary, when Kemi Badenoch was Business Secretary, all of them reportedly had private meetings with Murdoch when he was in London. Keir Starmer also had meetings with him leading up to the general election. Look where he's at now. In Australia, he single-handedly repealed the country's carbon tax and helped bring down a series of prime ministers in the past couple of decades, as well as pushing some into the limelight and getting them elected. That is how much power this one man from Australia has. Ronald Reagan thanked him for helping him flip New York to being Republican. Murdoch was cozying up and speaking to Trump almost every single day when he was president. According to former British Secretary of State Peter Mandelson, upsetting Murdoch was a no-go area. He was, and still is, the first man to break Britain. How, do you ask? By setting up the groundwork for all the following actors to come into play. The second man that broke Britain is not actually a man at all. It's Margaret Thatcher, the so-called Iron Lady. Thatcher entered office in 1979 on promises of economic and social neoliberalism. The country was being hit by sky-high inflation and strikes bringing down the country for years, and believed that her strong stance against the unions was what people really needed, as well as shrinking the size of the state. But did it work? And what were the long-lasting effects of her policies? Well, to start off with, there were 3.3 million unemployed people in Britain in 1984, compared to 1.5 million when she came into power in 1979. That figure did come down to 1.6 million by the end of her premiership. The number of pensioners living in poverty also increased from 3.1 million to 4.1 million. Household debt to GDP went up from 37 to 70%. Unemployment hit 9.5%, which is actually still higher than any rate since, and even higher than the COVID unemployment rate. Thatcher's policies also ended up wiping out 15% of the British industrial base in just a few years. In Thatcher's first 2 years alone, 20% of Scottish jobs were gone. Under her tenure, thefts per 1,000 people went up by 53%, and overall crime rate by 34%. With the right to buy scheme, almost half of the council homes that were let go at that time are now under private ownership, and the average rent is double what local housing associations offer. It dried up council housing without making a replacement for it. The number of single-family households sharply rose. Inequality shot right up. Normally in countries like Norway and even petrostates like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, once natural resources are found in the ground, a sovereign wealth fund is set up in order to take the earnings and invest it for a sustainable future. With Thatcher and the North Sea oil, at the rate that they were exporting it and the amount of damage it was having onto the currency, it led to the head of British Leyland, modern-day Jaguar Land Rover, to say that it would have been better to leave the bloody thing in the ground. People like to think that Thatcher is some person who implemented tough but necessary decisions. Difficult but sound and necessary economic decisions. But throughout Thatcher's entire time in office, her entire 11 years, only twice did the UK exceed the economic growth rate that was seen under the previous Labour government, in 1987-1988. For only 2 years did she run a budgetary surplus, and for every single year, she not once reduced unemployment below the highest level achieved by every post-war Labour government. Perhaps what she is most known for is her fight with the miners. She closed down many mines located primarily in the north, devastating their economies, and a policy which we can still see the effects of today. We went from having 300,000 miners in the mid-1970s, right before she came into office, to 230,000 miners in 1980. And by 1990, only 57,000 of them remained. She had referred to the miners and its unions as the enemy within. As if this wasn't bad enough, unlike other prime ministers, there was no real effort to replace those jobs and bring in new industries to revive the economies. This, combined with her push to deregulate the city of London in the event known as the Big Bang, was what really accelerated the north-south divide as we see it today. When Thatcher took office in 1979, 82% of the British workforce were protected under collective agreement. In 1996, that figure had dropped to 35% and just 26% today. Unions were basically made illegal under Thatcher, curbed their power immensely, and made collective bargaining pretty much impossible to do. Hypocritically, this wasn't a free market solution. This was nothing but big state intervention. Along with the Greater London Council, the 6 metropolitan councils were abolished, with powers transferred to unelected bodies. According to British historian Eric Hobsbawm, Thatcher oversaw an industrial holocaust, which saw Britain reduce its industrial output by a full quarter in the years of 1980 to 1984. She was also known for her privatisation of many public bodies, such as British Gas, British Telecom, British Water, British Aerospace, British Airways, Brit Oil, British Petroleum, Jaguar Land Rover, British Water and Steel. Thatcher claimed that privatisation was a way to give power back to the people. However, as director of the Progress Pressure Group said, now in 2012, it's clear that the result of electricity privatisation was to take power away from the people. Small British shareholders have no influence over the overwhelmingly non-British owners of the firms that generate and distribute power in Britain. As for schools, a policy that was implemented in the 1940s that allowed students and mothers to get free milk was removed, giving her the nickname Margaret Thatcher the Milk Snatcher. Britain also had the highest level of child poverty in all of Europe by 1997. Due to the introduction of school league tables and schools trying to look good in public, school expulsions exploded. And suddenly you had tens of thousands of students that were kicked out of school with nowhere else to go, roaming the streets and causing trouble. The policies and culture of the Thatcher era led to a doubling of the prison population in the 2 decades from her premiership to the end. When it came to international diplomacy, Britain was one of just 2 countries who would not just vote against, but actively block any sanctions being placed on apartheid South Africa, along with the United States of America with Reagan. She even called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. She backed a violent coup in Chile, which helped the far-right dictator Pinochet overthrow the democratically elected left-wing government of Chile and killed thousands of civilians and ruled with an iron fist. She even visited him when he was arrested in London and sent him scotch as a gift. She entered the UK into the European exchange rate mechanism, which led to Black Wednesday and the run on the pound, which almost crippled the British economy completely. As Labour MP Dan Jarvis pointed out, the negative impact of her government is far easier to identify and can still be seen in the long-term structural issues present today. Issues that include growing inequality, the over-reliance of our economy on a poorly regulated financial sector, and our resultant overexposure to the 2007 and 8 crash. And also the north-south income, wealth, power and productivity gaps that harm both our economy and our society. We come on to number 3 on the list, the first man who's actually British, David Cameron. You might be surprised to hear me say David Cameron and not say John Major, who ended up actually leading us into the European exchange rate, or Tony Blair with his war crimes in Iraq and what he did with the financial crisis, or Gordon Brown, who actually experienced the financial crisis. But no, I say David Cameron, the man who inherited it. I say this not trying to belittle the issues and crashes that came before, but that they weren't necessarily responsible for the damage Britain ensued today. Countries have lost their currency's value before. Countries have gone through financial recessions before. Countries have gone into illegal wars before. Countries have even gone into the same Great Recession we went into. But ours was uniquely bad, because it was the reaction to it that led to the downfall of Britain today. Coming off of the back of the Great Financial Recession and multiple Tory losses, David Cameron came in trying to rebrand the Conservative Party away from the image of the nasty party that was labelled in the 90s. That was the first time we saw the usage of the term the compassionate Conservative. And to this day, David Cameron will tell you that one of his proudest achievements was legalising same-sex marriage. It was all about social liberalism and economic conservatism, which need to tighten our wallet a little bit as the Great Recession just made us broke. Leading to the famous note by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Liam Bryan, who claimed, "I'm afraid we are all out of money," when he was leaving office. I did a full video discussing Britain and the financial crisis over here if you want to have a look. So Cameron and his Chancellor George Osborne went on a whole campaign trying to reduce the budget as much as possible in order to reduce the debt. It came off of the back of a research paper published by two Harvard economics professors called Growth in a Time of Debt, which highlighted that countries with higher debt tend to grow much more slowly than countries with lower levels of debt. The issue was that this paper actually had a mathematical error in it that no one else picked up. It ended up greatly exaggerating just how much countries with lower levels of debt would grow compared to higher levels of debt. That wouldn't be discovered until many years later. At that point, it was too late. And the reason why I refer to David Cameron as the man who broke Britain in this case, as opposed to Brown or Blair, is while they ended up turning a blind eye to the banks, it wasn't the Great Recession that brought us down, but our response to it and the years of austerity that led from that. Quick side note, if you feel you've gotten some value from this video, a subscribe would be great. So what did the years of austerity bring us? Lower wages, NHS on its knees, schools crumbling, crime soaring. Again, all explained in this video over here. One could ask the people of this country, how did no one notice the signs of this country getting worse from these policies? The answer is, we were already distracted a couple of years into their premiership by something else.
Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day!
Ah yes, Brexit. Bringing us on to the fourth man, Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage, inflammatory personality. He's just a man of the people.
What strikes me is you have this, and I know you are the bloke down the pub with a wet Labrador, a Barber jacket and mustard corduroy trousers.
Sounds about right.
Exactly right. Drinking a pint of Spitfire, looking back at the great days of empire and Winston Churchill and storming the beaches.
He's just the average bloke who stood for Parliament 8 times. He's not racist. He's just a man down the pub.
He attends private prep school before enrolling at the fee-paying Dulwich College at the age of 10.
The man who says things how they are, but isn't racist.
An English teacher at Dulwich College writes that a colleague who teaches Farage, quote, described his publicly professed racist and neo-fascist views, while another colleague recounted that, at a combined cadet force camp organised by the college, Farage and others had marched through a quiet Sussex village very late at night, shouting Hitler Youth songs. One Jewish pupil will later recall how Farage would sidle up to him and say Hitler was right and gas them. Fellow pupil Nick Gordon-Brown remembers he looked like a middle-aged man when he was a sixth former. He was a very vocal National Front supporter. There was a Jewish lad at school whom he was horrible to. With Jewish schoolmates, he made no secret of his distaste for them. What you see now is what he was like then. Years later, when confronted with the allegations, Farage will give an awkward response.
Yes, of course, I said some ridiculous things that upset
Racist
them.
things.
Not necessarily racist things.
Not
but things.
necessarily racist.
Well, it depends how you define it.
Farage denies any involvement in far-right politics as a youth. With just days to go before the EU referendum, Farage unveils his now infamous Breaking Point poster. It immediately draws comparisons with similar imagery used by the Nazis in Germany. Even prominent Brexiteer Michael Gove says he shuddered when he saw the poster. Leave wins the EU referendum. Farage resigns as UKIP leader.
He just might have some dodgy people that he looks up to.
Previously declared Powell his political hero and endorsed the basic principle of his notoriously racist Rivers of Blood speech and even acted as his chauffeur.
This country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
Stop. Do you know why Churchill in 1933 was almost the only person to see Hitler as a threat? Because he'd seen it with fanatical Islam when he'd fought against it in the 1890s. A lot of the stuff you're criticising is how ordinary folk down the pub speak.
I'm sorry, Islam and Nazis. I'm sorry, I've got to come back to that, Nigel Farage.
Well, Winston Churchill clearly was a very bad man because he thought exactly the same.
And some dodgy people that he associates himself with.
UKIP candidate in Salisbury at the general election, again coming fourth. The following month he meets Mark Devon, a former UKIP activist who is now head of research at the neo-Nazi BNP, and the editor of Mindbenders, a supposed expose of Jews in the media. Farage is seeking compromising information on UKIP leader Alan Sked in an effort to oust him. A photo shows Farage and Devon at the meeting, along with Tony Leckermer, a BNP member who served 3 years in prison for handling explosives in an attempt to bomb a left-wing group. Leckermer was given another 3 years for stabbing a Jewish schoolteacher who had been trying to remove a BNP sticker on the underground. By now, he has appeared on the Kremlin-owned Russia Today TV channel 17 times between 2010 and 2014. Farage is clear about his admiration for the Russian president.
I was asked a couple of months ago, which world leader did I admire? And I said Vladimir Putin as an operator.
May 2014. By now, Farage is joint leader of the group Europe of Freedom and Democracy, alongside Italian far-right leader Francesco Speroni of the Lega Nord party. Speroni has defended Anders Breivik, the Norwegian far-right terrorist who killed 77 people, including dozens of children, in an attack in 2011.
He described Anders Breivik as someone whose ideas are in defence of Western civilization.
No, he didn't, actually. He didn't. One of his members did, and we kicked him out of the group.
No, you're thinking of Maria Borghesio, who went further and said in a radio interview that Breivik had some excellent ideas. But Speroni himself, who is your co-chair of this group, said that Breivik's ideas are in defence of Western civilization.
February 2017. Farage is endorsed for the job of Prime Minister by David Duke, former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. March 2017, Farage appears on Russian state TV channel RT, where he's knighted by a 6-year-old girl, after which the little girl tells him,
"My mummy says you hate foreigners."
No, little girl, no.
September 2017. Farage is invited by the granddaughter of Adolf Hitler's finance minister to address the German far-right AfD party at an election rally. He receives a standing ovation.
He's just a concerned member of the public who stood for Parliament 8 times and wants to improve the country.
The dismantling of the NHS.
And I think we're going to have to move to an insurance-based system of healthcare.
And he has found the problem. It's the European Union, with its immigration and its bureaucracy. Bureaucracy which, just to point out, he has not once voted to amend since his time in 2009, despite leading the biggest British party in the European Parliament. He literally had the power to amend the same pieces of legislation he criticised, but chose not to. To Farage and people like him, it has always been primarily about immigration. If we just curb immigration numbers, everything else will come back into balance. All our problems will go away. This even includes spouting lies about immigration and just using fear-mongering over things that will just never materialise and have no basis in evidence. Put simply, he is okay with being poorer as long as there are fewer immigrants in the country. And this isn't just hyperbole, he actually said this. And everything seems to be the fault of the European Union to him. He criticised the Vote Leave campaign on not focusing enough on immigration, and that they need to speak more about the EU's open border policy in order to fight the enemy. Even the period of time where his bank account got closed was the fault of the European Union, despite the fact that the laws were actually held by the British Parliament. But it was actually EU regulations which ended up saving him from any supposed political persecution.
Fortunately for Farage, there is legislation protecting bank account holders from discrimination based on political beliefs, if indeed that's what's really happened. The law in question has been retained by the UK, but it was originally passed by the European Union.
Funny that. He has banged on about the EU Human Rights Act and how certain criminals are able to stay in the UK, mentioning only 1 or 2 one-off cases, despite the fact that there is no such thing as the EU Human Rights Act. Put simply, he either grossly exaggerated, dishonestly cherry-picked, or flat out lied his way into pushing David Cameron to push for a Brexit referendum. And when he got what he wanted, what did he do? Grossly exaggerate, dishonestly cherry-pick, and flat out lie yet again to get his way to victory. What did we expect? The most famous example was the big red bus saying, "We send £350 million to the EU every single week. Let's fund our NHS instead." That was a smashing success. It was by far one of the most successful pieces of propaganda ever on British soil. The only problem was, just like with all the other claims, it was just flat out not true. For starters, the figure was actually 250 million, not 350 million. And if you take away all the amount that we get back from the EU every single week, that is just £160 million, less than half the original amount that he claimed. And that's before factoring in all the economic benefit we get from that. As with the second lie, the truth was that if we left the EU, we would not be sending that amount to the NHS. That was conveniently mentioned the day after the referendum was had, contrary to what the Vote Leave campaign was saying.
The £350 million a week we send to the EU, which we will no longer send to the EU, can you guarantee that's going to go to the NHS?
No, I can't, and I would never have made that claim.
17 million people have voted for leave.
Yep.
I don't know how many people voted on the basis of that advert, but that was a huge part of the propaganda. You're now saying that's a mistake?
We have a £10 billion a year, a £34 million a day featherbed that is going to be free money that we can spend on the NHS, on schools, or whatever it is.
But you're not guaranteeing that that money, as promised, will go to the NHS.
You must understand, I was ostracised by the official Leave campaign and as I've always done, did my own thing.
Do you think there are other things that people will wake up this morning and find out aren't going to happen?
I don't know, was it the wisest move to put the decision to the public? I don't know. I mean, the most Googled question the day after the referendum was, what was the EU? After finding out that they were lied to, a lot of Britons ended up having regret over their decision. Such as a majority favouring to rejoin the EU, a majority thinking it was a mistake to ever leave the EU, and 647 out of 650 constituencies regretting to ever vote for the EU referendum. Yes, let me repeat that. Only 1 out of 650 constituencies does not regret voting for Brexit, which is Boston and Skegness. But even ignoring all the regrets faced by Britain, there is no denying the negative effect that Brexit has had on our country. Even Nigel Farage is not able to deny. The British economy is £140 billion smaller than it would have been had we stayed in the economy, which is 6% of entire GDP. By 2035, that gap would amount to £311 billion. HMRC would have been collecting £40 billion extra every single year had we not left in taxes. There are 1.8 million fewer jobs in the UK than had we stayed in the EU, including over 500,000 in construction and almost 400,000 in finance. All thanks to Brexit. 30% of the increase in food prices between 2020 and 2023 was due to Brexit, which means that the increase in food prices alone has cost the average household £105 per year. For context, the figure of how much we send to the EU every single week, 55% of that was just used to subsidise our increased food prices. The income loss alone is £850 per capita and projected to be £2,300 by 2035, which means that just today, we'd need 4 of those buses to make up the income loss alone, and it still wouldn't cover how much poorer we are. Analysis shows this time last year that investment would have been 25% higher than it is right now, thanks to Brexit. Even Sir Richard Branson said that Brexit would put him off from investing in the same country that made him a billionaire. Put simply, Brexit has made us poorer by a large margin, and 2/3 of the country agrees. And it was pretty much all pushed, at least publicly, by this man. The man and the vision supported by newspapers such as the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and the Sun. Guess whose support he's got? That's right, Rupert Murdoch. It's all coming full circle again. For years, his newspapers have been poisoning the world with Euro myths, disinformation, and turning random EU politicians into villains in the public eye, such as the headline "Up Yours Delors" when referring to the EU Commission President Jacques Delors. So here we are, enjoying our newfound freedoms outside of the EU, selling bendy bananas or whatever it is we were doing now. Feeling regretful the minute the referendum had ended. COVID came and went, and so did Boris Johnson in the office of Prime Minister. We had our economic downturn, which not only did we have it worse than any other G7 nation, but it turned out that as bad as the pandemic was, economically Brexit would still be a bigger dent in our economy than the pandemic, according to the chairman of the OBR. Austerity was cutting into the country more and more. We can see food bank waiting lines go up, NHS crumbling, schools literally falling apart, trains and public transport all getting noticeably worse. And then
мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
The war in Ukraine sent an energy shock that led our food, oil and gas prices soaring. This led to our highest rate of inflation in 40 years. And this leads us on to our 5th and final, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. Liz Truss stood for the position of Prime Minister after Boris Johnson had left and ended up beating former Chancellor Rishi Sunak into the office with just 80,000 votes. 80,000 votes was enough to get you into the office of Prime Minister of almost 70 million people. She appointed Kwasi Kwarteng to the office of Chancellor, whose background was studying classics and history at the University of Cambridge after attending Eton College. His PhD thesis was on the political thought surrounding the recoinage crisis of 1695. In reality, he had co-written Truss's book Britannia Unchained a few years earlier, which is probably a big reason he got that role. Seeing rising inflation and severe increases in the cost of living, Liz Truss set out her mini-budget, which included £161 billion of unfunded tax cuts, with a further £60 billion in energy support, all to be fueled by debt. It involved cutting the basic income rate, upper income bracket, reversing the rise in national insurance, lifting the cap on banker bonuses, reversing increase in corporation tax, pushing people off of benefits, and more. The basic idea was that by cutting income and corporation tax, it would lead to more economic growth as people would go out and spend more. A laissez-faire utopian economy would come out of this, and the government would be able to collect more tax revenue from this. The markets, unfortunately, did not see eye to eye. The pound tanked against the dollar and the euro, almost reaching 1-to-1 with the dollar for the first time in history. It looked more and more likely like Britain would not be able to pay off her debts in the next 20 and 30 years. The bond market, known as gilt in the UK, tanked. UK pension funds also almost went completely bankrupt, as a lot of their money is tied up in LDIs such as gilts in order to meet regulatory requirements. They are normally seen as a very safe investment, so pension funds are normally over-invested in them. After seeing the con, the Bank of England ended up having to do a £65 billion buyback of bonds on the market in order to reduce panic. According to the Sunday Times, Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor who brought forth the mini-budget, had attended a party in Chelsea earlier that week with a bunch of city bankers and hedge fund managers. They were reportedly to have benefited from a crash in the pound and had apparently egged him on to do so. Curious. It had turned out that the Bank of England and the Treasury were not briefed about this mini-budget before it was released. The OBR had warned against releasing this mini-budget, but Kwarteng went ahead with it anyways. The aftermath saw cost of living get worse, inflation go up, which led to interest rates being sharply increased by the Bank of England to the highest rate in 14 years, with people now paying more for their mortgages, their bills and their food. Liz Truss ended up losing out to a head of lettuce, who was replaced by Rishi Sunak but was unable to quell any of the problems in Britain, who is now replaced by Keir Starmer, who frankly haven't got much hope with. At the end of the day, Murdoch is still a multi-billionaire with his media empire. Thatcher enjoyed a cushy £500,000 a year job as a consultant in a tobacco firm after leaving the office of Prime Minister. The war criminal Tony Blair runs his organisation, TBI, Tony Blair Institute, and is worth upwards of £50 million. Cameron made £1 million writing and selling his book, and returned to be a Lord and Foreign Minister, which pays a lot. Nigel Farage tried to enter into the American politics sphere. When he failed, just ended up coming back to Britain and won a seat as an MP. He still blames the EU for many problems we have today, 4 years after we have nothing to do with them anymore. Liz Truss is over in America screeching about how it was the deep state that brought her down, but is also doing quite well financially. The woman who deindustrialized the North and halted the economy, as well as screwing future generations with their privatization. The man who introduced a policy of austerity and refused to lift it despite seeing how many disabled people he was hitting and how many working class people he was harming. How much poverty he caused and how many people started using food banks, and still went for the EU referendum. The man who lied through his teeth for years in order to get us to leave the union, which benefited us economically. And when he got it, lied through his teeth even more to win. And in the process, made us all poorer. The woman who crashed our economy for the sake of her own right-wing ideals and left us dealing with the mess again. And finally, the man who ensured that this would all be possible through thick and thin. Murdoch, Thatcher, Cameron, Blair, Truss, Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Priti Patel, Michael Gove, Suella Braverman, Lee Anderson, Boris Johnson, I could go on. All of these people have had a major hand in flushing this country down the drain further and further. But they are all completely insulated from the effects themselves. It's difficult to just point at 5 people and claim they are the ones that broke Britain, especially as it won't really do us much good now. The system itself allows for grifters and panderers to go into the system and flourish, wreak havoc on the nation and then leave. It is up to us to hold them to a higher standard and not to fall for their tricks. We need a complete overhaul of the system to ensure that we don't get any more politicians like this, or people in power like Rupert Murdoch ever again.